Snow had no place on the city of red brick and yellow dust. Yet by dawn a thin bloom of frost had taken to the lime-washed stones on the eastern face of the walls. It came on the wind from the narrow sea and the stormlands beyond, a tide of cold so clean it scraped the throat when you breathed. John stood there, gloved hand flat on the crenel, and watched the light struggle up in the east. The Blackwater Bay lay bruised and glassy. Rigging ticked against masts. The gulls were gone. The gulls had left 2 mornings ago. Behind him, the city made its own weather. A million breaths turned lanes to fog. Smoke from 1,000 hearths tried to rise and was pinned by the low sky, so it pooled between slanted roofs and hung like a weight over Flea Bottom. The smell was a crowded smell, saltfish and old wine, dung crushed into mortar, the sour of bodies pressed together. The refugees had filled every alley where a horse could not pass. They slept along the city's spine like scales. You could trace the roads by the lines of their cooking fires. In the long lanes, children with blue fingers blew at twigs and cried when the matchlight caught. Footsteps came careful behind him. "It is colder today," Tyrion said, voice roughened by the air. John nodded. He had slept an hour 2 nights past, and before that 3 on the rocking bench of a galley with his boots on. The cold lived in him now. The ravens! From Duskendale and Rosby. What was a rumor is now an accounting. They are coming on the King's Road as a river comes, entire and without seam. Fields white. The living who fled are behind them, too slow and too many. Tyrion laid a folded map on the Merlin and held the corners down with his small hands. 2 days at the most if the cold holds. Perhaps 3 if it breaks. It will not break. The words left John without heat. He looked out again, past ships with trimmed sails, to the black cut of Dragonstone on the horizon. It had been a keep in fog once and a safe name. Now it was only shape. How many boats did we find by the piers last night? 300 river craft, 40 of the king's galleys, all the black-sailed Lyseni who had not run at the first whisper of winter. Tyrion's mouth twitched. We are making sailors of bakers and small boys. I have Davos wringing ships from air. Davos can wring salt from the sun. John blew into his hands and prayed no one saw. We'll load by wards. Old Town Gate first. The Sept cellars as a queuing hall. Keep the road to the Lion Gate clear for carts. I admire your faith in roads, Tyrion said. There are no roads. There are tunnels of people. We could spend 3 days emptying the city by ship and leave 500,000 on the quays. 500,000. Stark Mathematics. He could not set that number next to the other one that lived in him now, the one that was not a number but a color, the pale glass blue that had eaten men he had loved. He pressed his eyes shut until he saw a ring of white and kept them closed, breathing slow, willing his hands to cease their tremor. Where is she? He asked. Where she always is before the day breaks, in the great hall with the windows unshuttered, staring east at what she believes is hers by law and fire. Tyrion folded the map. I have said truth to her. She hears it and she does not. Perhaps tell her without words. John took that and said nothing. He followed the hand toward the Tower of the Hand, down the stairs into a day that would not warm, down through men huddled in cloaks with steaming mouths, through a hall where no tapestries stirred because the air was so still even dust was careful. The Red Keep had known a mad king's footfall and the quiet tread of spider and whisperer. It had tasted wildfire smoke. He wondered what it thought of the northern dirt on his boots. He thought of nothing else until the doors parted. She stood with the light on her hair so it burned without heat. A woman lit from within by a fire that was not warmth but the memory of it. Drogon drowsed on a platform of stone below the windows with his wings folded tight as a sail furled in a storm. His breath moved the torch flames. Regal, hurt and healing, slept lower in a hail of straw, ribs creaking when he drew air, green-black hide glossed by oil. There were 3 women in the hall. The other 2 wore brown wool and carried water. One would be remembered by no one but the other. Daenerys did not turn when he came to her. It did not matter. She knew his steps. She had learned his silences like a language. There's something in the air from the east, she said. Ice with teeth. They are 2 days behind the rumor of them. He stood a breath away. He saw the day on her cheek, pale and hard. Tyrion says 3. I have watched winter move like a thought across a field, she said. It does not need roads. He remembered a field of men breathing mist, a lake that cracked and sang under a blue wind, the skin of winter that had peeled back like a scab to let rage through. He remembered Viserion falling with a cry no dragon ever had and rising with none. Drogon opened a single slit of golden eye and fixed it on Jon as if he, too, could see that memory. Jon put a hand to the warm stone of the window's edge until he could call now back to him. We can fill the ships all day and night and lose most of them when the ice comes for the water, he said. We can block the gates and have them climb, or we can make fire a wall. She turned then. Her mouth was a small line, almost a child's mouth, but the rest of her was older than any of them. Say it. We put fire between the dead and the living, he said, the words a slow knife. We burn the city. Her fingers were on the sill and they whitened. He saw the knuckles. He did not look up at her eyes for a long count so that he could say the rest. Not with oil, not with the alchemist's green hell. We do it clean and fast. We make sure there is nothing to take. There is no one for them to turn when they come. The Mad King dreamed of a day like this. It was quiet, as if she said it to herself. He whispered to himself until the words were a friend, and the friend told him to be a god. I have spent a lifetime walking backward from that whisper. I am not asking you to be your father. He felt the weight of it on his tongue. He tasted ash. I am asking you to be a dragon. The word had a shape in her. He saw it find her spine. He saw the tremor that ran through her and halted halfway down her arm, as if her body remembered a heat that hurt. We will save who we can, she said. We will empty the city until the water will not take the boats. And then we will. Her mouth hardened. How will history say it? No, I do not care for history. How will the living say it? They will call you butcher. They can. They will, he said. He had learned by now that there were words that landed like snowfall, soft at first, then heavier, accumulating unlooked-for weight until roofs broke. He put this one in her hands to hold for a moment so he did not have to. They can carve it on my grave. I will not live to carry it long. But if we leave them this city and its people, the dead will have an army that will not tire. They will turn every child who ran as slow as his mother's legs can carry him. They will eat the heat from the bones and come for us across the ice. One city feeds them for a war. One city starves us all. I swore to be the shield that guards the realms of men. A shield burns, too. Drogon's head lifted. Somewhere outside the hall a bell tolled once, twice. No pattern, just a man with a rope and cold hands, looking at clouds that looked back. Daenerys looked past Jon to the dragon, past the dragon to the pale east. You would carry this thing, she said. You would put it in your arms and call it yours. He smiled without any humor that he could find. I would put it in the snow with me and lie down next to it. She reached for his hand then, the first warmth he had felt in the day that was not stolen from stone. She did not squeeze. She placed her fingers in the bend of his own as if listening to his pulse. It made him aware of it, the low thud, the life that insisted on itself. We will save who we can, she said again. Davos will have his ships. Tyrion will have his lines. I will have my dragons. Her voice did not change. And you will have the words to tell them. I will speak in the square, he said. You will speak in the square, she echoed, as if binding him to a spell. By the time Jon stood on the stone above the fishmonger's square, the city had become a sound. Dockworkers with hands like knots, mothers with infants already asleep despite the tumult, boys with shaved heads from the hospital of the faith, old men with iron keys on string around their necks. The mass of them made a hum that had no pitch, only hunger and fear and the old animal push toward a door. Unruly gold cloaks lounged on their halberds and watched the press with eyes that had not slept. Davos had a crate for him and a man to steady it because the plank he stood on had ice on it. Davos himself stood below, looking up with the mouth of a man swallowing salt. John said no words at first. He let them see him. Sometimes faces mattered more than what they said. He had learned that when he called men to hold a gate that cracked with hands of ice on the other side. He thought it might be true here. He took off one glove and held it up so they could see the hand that once had been black-gloved and belonged to the night. Then he spoke. He told them what could be told. He did not adorn it. He did not say the dead had blue eyes and hated everything warm. He said they went on and on where they went and they turned what they found. He said the city could not be held because no city could hold winter behind walls. He said the dragons were fire and fire was the only wall that held long. He said the ships were there, and the keys would move like a river if they followed lines and obeyed the men with orange sashes and women with red scarves. He said the faith would bless those who went first and those who went worst, and he would post guards at the bread carts to stop men with swords from eating all the loaves. And then he said the other thing. We will set a ring of fire around the city before the dead can take it, he said. And the hum shifted, as wind shifts inside a chimney. The words moved. The sound they made moving across that space made him think of when snow slides from the eaves of a hall with a sigh just before it falls. We will burn what the dead would use against us. I will bear it. I will answer for it with any man who survives. And from the press a voice, a woman's old and reed-thin and sharp from the clean side of hunger. You will kill us. John had thought of her already. She had sat by his bed while he was dead, and he had heard her mutter to a god without kind eyes. She had stood by a gate with a plank in her hands when men came with knives. He saw her in the crowd now. She wore a ratty shawl with embroidery that must have once been red and now was the color of weather. I will not, he said. I will kill the city. Someone laughed then. A bright bark, a child's, as if the words were a piece of mischief. That turned the hum to a knife edge and John felt the crowd's weight lean. Davos lifted his hand and the orange-sashed men fanned the pressure into lanes again. If 1,000,000 people turned and ran, the city would kill more than any dragon ever could. John kept his voice low and even. Those near the docks will go first, he said. Each ward will follow in number. Do not run. Do not hoard. Bread will be at the gates and each hand will get a loaf. I have seen men killed over a heel that would have been stale in an hour. Do not be those men. Those men, Davos muttered below, are always already here, but when the first line began to move, it did so. The orange sashes worked because the sashes meant something now and not just cloth. The bells from the sept began, slow and steady, to mark the pace, and the priests and septas with soot black on their foreheads made signs over children's hair as they passed as if they could bless a tide. Tyrion appeared at Jon's elbow like a shadow that had forgotten its man. You will be killed for this, he said in a voice that lacked any ornament now, any taunt or lace. If you live through the day and the next two, 1,000 men will be making plans for your death in 100 smoky rooms, and they will rehearse the speeches they will give their sons about how they were braver than you. If we do not do this, no one will live to make speeches, Jon said. Tyrion's face shaped something like a smile and abandoned it. I used to be proud of knowing what men would do with a word, he said. Now words scurry like mice away from the first thing inside me. I am cold and I am tired and I cannot help you with this, but I will stand here while you do it. I will not run away and call it a strategy. He looked up. Do you hear them? Jon did. A new sound layered on the city sound, a grinding of chains and the run of boots in hallways not used since the last war. Alchemists stirred green in their tall glass, knowing that none of it would be used, because a queen had refused to let loose the jars except in extremity, and there were men in orange saying no. The dragons would do it. It would be clean. Only there was no clean here. That was a lie he would not say. He left the square when the first 10 boats hugged crowded water and moved north along the quays, slow as grief. The day had not warmed. It would not. The clouds were a roof stooped so low their breath hit it and dripped back down. Jon walked with Davos because there was no one else who could hold the shape of this day without breaking. They went along the spine of the quays, past fishermen tie-cutting their nets into strips to make ropes, past women with old chains of fine gold and young hands to sell them. passed a boy with an full of splinters and another boy pulling them out with his teeth because his hands shook. Davos spoke to each boatmaster in a voice that had held sway over storms and smugglers both. He talked of tide and the places where the Blackwater held eddies like waiting mouths. He told them to pull east toward open water, then south, keep the city's burned parts to their starboard when they came. Do not look, do not go back. If you hear the screams, row harder. When the sun had stopped its pretense and begun to be a light with a rim of iron around it. When it was noon by the clocks and twilight by the sky, Jon went back up into the Red Keep. The hall was fuller now, not of courtiers but of those whose bodies believed in ceilings. Arya was on the stair, half a shadow. She had come in the night on a pale mare with ice in its whiskers. Winter made no sound on her. She had watched him in the square and he had felt her eyes like a blade across the knuckles. He caught her now at the turn. "Do not," she said. Her face was a bare place, winter-stripped. Only the eyes moved, and in them the slow burn he remembered from when she was small, and he had seen her hold stubbornness like a warm thing inside a cold day. "There is nothing else," he said. "There is always something else," she said. "Except this. This is the thing after the last one. After this, there is only the thing that eats you." She put her hand in his, fierce, fast. Her fingers were no bigger than when she was 9 in memory, and the memory bit him like a nail. "Then let it eat me and not the realm." He thought she might say more. She did not. She made herself as thin as a thought and vanished down a corridor where old kings went to sit forever and look at nothing. Daenerys was already in the yard. Men were binding iron around Drogon's saddle. Straps that had cut her and healed and cut again until the scars lay like a map under silk. Rhaegal shook his head slowly in pain and impatience. The healers had done what they could with honey and boiled water and herbs that smelled like wild meadows under frost. A dragon's wound did not care about men's plants. It did not close because of prayer. It closed because will and heat and time made a seam out of it. Jon went to Drogon's shoulder and laid his palm there, as he had learned to do, not with fear but the respect due a mountain that could move. The heat baked his glove. Drogon's eye rolled to him, took him in, decided he was a man the queen had chosen to stand near her flame and not be eaten. Jon felt the breath push him in his chest and then the weight of it as Drogon exhaled and put the day over him like a cloak. Daenerys had put armor on. It made a shell of her, a bright, beatable thing. He wished she had come out in wool, in the gray she had worn once in the snow when she had first seen the wall and had said nothing for a long time after. He wished for too many small things. He took the reins in his hands and felt the tremor in her grip travel up them as a fish's fight travels up a line. "When the bells ring thrice in count and thrice again, begin," he said. "I will begin when I am ready," she said. But her mouth softened when she saw how he flinched at her tone. "I will begin at the bells." He nodded. The bells felt like a lie now. He turned from her and found Tyrion there, and if he had been another man he would have laughed. Tyrion had found a cup of something steaming to hold, not to drink. He had always needed props more than songs. Davos stood at his other hand. Between them Jon felt like a piece of iron discovering itself between hammer and anvil. "I have never prayed to any god," Tyrion said softly. "I do not know the words. I find I wish to say them now out of a kind of cowardice. Is there one to do with mercy?" "Mercy is a thing men give," Davos said. "Gods give weather." A boy ran with a rope in his fist. The bells took the day into their mouths and shook it. 1, 2, 3. A pause long enough to feel your own heart fall out of step. 4, 5, 6. The air itself seemed to wait after the last. Then Drogon's wings hit it like a smith's blow, and the yard went away under a storm of dust and ash. Jon staggered. He did not look up because men who looked up when dragons flew him never saw the ground again properly. He felt the wind and the heat the way a man in a forge feels it and knows where to stand and where to put his hands and when to leave before the thing on the anvil becomes its own mood. He walked to the wall. He put both hands on the stone and leaned toward the city as if he could cover it with his body. The wind snatched his cloak. The first pass was the dragon's equivalent of a man testing a blade. Drogon flew the line of the northern wall, and his breath spilled in a scarlet sheet that slicked the parapets and fell in cords into the ditches beyond. It passed in a heartbeat, and yet it lasted half an hour in his body. Jon saw the fire take to carts and wooden sheds outside the gate. He saw men who had slept there because the gate guards would not let them in, slap at their blankets and then run not back toward the city but sideways, like beasts with no word for what had happened except the old word fire. He did not see anyone die on that first pass. He let himself breathe once, only once. The second pass cut a line along the street of flour and turned every hanging awning to a scream. The cloth fell and then rose again in flame like a thing possessed by a stubborn spirit that would not learn the lesson of gravity. Fire is a teacher, teaches fast. Jon tasted the oil of lampblack and then something sweet and ugly. Fat finding a wick, fat hungry to burn. Bells rang from the September of Baelor because men with ropes had been told to pull them until they had no hands left. The B.L.'s made order of hell for a time. Pull, pause, pull. The third pass did not wait for bells. It took to the fish markets and boiled the slop underfoot into a stew that no man would eat and no dog could bear to smell. Men cut ropes that held boats to quays with knives they had stolen for bread the day before. They pushed until boats broke from their moorings like teeth pulled under duress. Jon watched a woman thrust her child into the arms of a stranger already in a boat and then step back from the edge because there was no more room. The stranger did not look back. The woman did not scream. She put both hands on her knees like a farmer and breathed and then stood and turned and walked away toward the smoke. All through it the cold came, the kind of cold that ate fire from the edges and made it cramp and shiver in the open air. It came as a pressure in his ears that told him the world was too big. It came as a silence under the noise. When he looked toward the north and the bend of the King's Road reaching the city like a hand, he saw it. The white line with moving specks that were not specks. They had come faster than a man could ride and say they had come. Tyrion gripped the stone so hard his knuckles bled. "Good," he said, and Jon wondered at the cruelty of that word in Tyrion's mouth, and then knew it was not cruelty. It was relief that they had not burned for nothing. Good. Let them see what we have made. What they had made was a letter written in flame to winter. Drogon strung his words across the city with a craft that was not human, and Regal, limping above the smoke with a fury that looked like joy to be hurting and still here, traced the lower lines, lower because his wings could not bear him higher for long. They made the wide streets into rivers no corpse could cross. They made of the gardens and parks an ash the dead would step into and find nothing there to feed cold. They spared the quays. They spared the points of embarkation because there was a line in Jon that would not let him break his own rope. He could not make a perfect destruction. He made a particular one and sent the dragons as a man sends hounds through a wood where he knows each deer path because he had walked them in a calmer age. At the gate of the Red Keep, a small boy with a dress of gray wool and a hole at the hem looked up at Jon and said, "Mister." The boy had a face like a sparrow's. Pointed, quick, scared and pretending not to be. Jon blinked down at him. He felt the moment pivot, ridiculous, heavy, as if the whole day had put a finger to his chest. "Your mother?" he asked. The boy shrugged. "She took my sister. I am 8. I can run." "You can," Jon said. "Down the serpent's spine to the water. If a man with an orange sash says stop, you stop. If a man with a red scarf says wait, you wait. If anyone tries to take your loaf, you bite." The boy nodded solemnly, and then he asked, "Because children are brutally practical in moments when grown men shape language into cudgels. Will I be burned?" "No," Jon said, and he found he was not lying because there were things a man could carve with will into the day. Even gods give weather, but men give mercy. He could write one small mercy. He called to a guard with a sash the color of a marigold, and the man bent like a bridge so the boy could cross his arms and be carried through the crush. Jon watched until the small gray head vanished in the motion of the crowd. Then he turned back to the wall because he could not watch any more small heads. He needed to look at the thing he had made. There were places the fire would not take. Old stone larded with wet. Wells that breathed and made circles of steam that pushed fire away like a stubborn smoke. The red-tiled domes of the bathhouses steamed and then cracked with a noise like a man's heart breaking in his chest. The Dragonfire reached and reached. The dead reached back. John saw the line like a color moving through the world, and he saw it hesitate when it came to the first river of flame and go around it and take another street and hit another and hesitate again. He did not know if dead minds could learn. He thought they could remember pain. He thought even hatred had sense. It was enough that they slowed. It was enough that they pressed their own bodies into the sheet of fire and made their own dead beliefs into fuel for a while. Enough and not enough, but a while is in some wars a lifetime. Night came early because smoke is a kind of night, and this night was inside their throats. Men wore cloth over their faces, and the cloth became a part of their faces, and when they took it off, their features came away with it in a print of soot and salt. The bells stopped because the men at the ropes had no hands that could pull, and the ones with hands had no breath that could travel rope to bell. In the absence of bells, there was dragon wing and the soft, endless noise flames make when they eat what is not meant to be eaten. That sound is like a crowd's hum reversed. It is the sound of the world doing math it had not planned to do. Tyrion slid to the stones and sat with his back against the wall and rested his head in his hands and laughed once. The most hopeless noise Jon had heard from him since he had met him at Winterfell in a boy's age. "Do you know," he said in a voice hoarse not from smoke but from something dry in the soul, "men will forgive a poor king and even a craven, and they will love a cruel queen if she is their cruelty and not someone else's, but they will never forgive you. Not because it was wrong, but because they needed a story here and you gave them none they can tell their children without waking them screaming." "I know," Jon said. It was not pride. It was not martyrdom. It was a fact like frost. He left Tyrion there in the old man's crouch of someone who has played all his cards and discovered the game was not that. He found Davos in the yard, his face a rard map. "Regal is falling," Davos said simply, and then, "Not falling, landing. He is a stubborn bastard." They went to the South Tower where the dragon pit had once been and was again. A makeshift circle of stone and iron where men had hammered a place for beasts that would not be contained if they truly wished not to be. Regal came down like a loose sail flapping, too angry to tuck in. He put his claws to earth and shook himself, and the steam that rose from his hide made them all stutter a step back. Dany slid down his shoulder, and when she touched the ground she crouched as if the earth itself were a beast she must placate. She stood and came to Jon with hair stuck to her cheek and ash in the corners of her mouth like coal. "How many?" she asked. "It is not a number," he said, "because it would not be contained by that small pen. Enough that the dead will have to use the gates." He had not expected himself to say anything that could be so obscenely like a jest. It fell between them and neither of them picked it up. Drogon landed then with a violence that cracked stone. He reeked of burned wool and boiled meat and the iron smell of blood that is not human. His mouth steamed, the air around it a mirage where heat bent sight. Jon put his hand to the jaw that could crush him like sugar and felt it tremble. The dragon shuddered the way a man shudders after a kill he did not want to make. Jon made the mistake of putting a human word to it. Then he stopped himself. They would require the dragon again before dawn. They did not sleep. The city did not sleep. The dead do not sleep, and the living who must face them learn their habits. Men pressed on keys until boards groaned. Oars creaked. The sea took what it could and refused what it could not carry. Davos moved among ships like a father among sons, cuffing one here, blessing another, spitting into the wind like a priest. Tyrion fielded petitions until every word sounded as if it were spoken through resin. Arya came and went with messages like a small wind bearing leaves and did not let Jon's eyes hold her longer than a breath at a time. Daenerys mounted Drogon before the moon had made up its mind to be seen and traced the lines again, refreshing the fire where the dead had pressed it thin with their bodies and their frozen will. By the fifth pass it was not a city at all but a map of lines written by a furious hand that pressed too hard. At some hour of night that was as much feeling as any position of a star, the cold became a presence on the wall that men could talk to without being mad. It pressed the skin in a way a lover would not at first but might if love had become a punishment. It made men stumble as a man does when he grows older suddenly, in a night without warning. Jon's breath came and frosted his beard, and then the frost fell to the stones. Then it happened. A light in the north that was neither moon nor fire nor dawn. A bloom of blue like a wound being born. The sound came after, the long tearing cry a dragon makes when it remembers another life. The dead had brought their own dragon to the negotiation. Vizirion's first breath across the fire was not a blow but a thought. The flame bowed. It did not go out. Another breath and it wavered like a man being held under water by 4 hands. The third took a section of the wall of fire and turned it to glass. Through the glass came the dead, in files as neat as a man can stand when he has no will left but the enemy's. Jon did not say any words. There were none. He ran. He ran not because a king runs, for kings do not and live long, but because a man who had sworn a thing and repeated it to himself when his heart faltered runs toward the place where that oath is needed. He slid on frost that had taken the stone like lichen. He took the tower stairs 3 at a time in boots not made for sprinting. He came out into the yard where Drogon had turned his head toward the sound and Regal had lifted his with effort as if the noise alone weighed him down. Daenerys swung into the saddle with one movement that was a dance she had repeated until even the gods would have had to admire the line of it. Jon reached for the harness and found his hands on hot iron. "Not you," she said, and for one heartbeat all that lived on her face was fear for him, ugly and pure. "You will not ride now." "I must," he said. "Your weight," she said stupidly, and then laughed, a ragged edge. "No, you will hold what is here. You will hold the men. I will do the sky." She touched his face with the backs of her fingers. "If I die up there, you will have to make what is left make sense." He put his hand over hers and pressed it to his cheek for the heartbeat he allowed them. Then she was gone into the air that had announced its king in blue. Drogon found height as if height were a debt he meant to collect. He went for the wound in the fire and made it red again and then bright white. Viserion came screaming and hit the heat like a thing slapping a wall and turned and came in again with a rage that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with being taken. Regal labored and rose with the same stubborn joy as before. If dragons pray, Jon thought, they must do it with their bodies. The duel in the air wrote its own story inches above a sea of heads. Men on the wall and in the courtyards looked up though they had been told not to. Men always look up at gods fighting. There were no gods here. Only beasts and the will of those who loved them. Viserion's blue line cut and froze and shattered. Drogon's heat wrote back with a quill of anger. Regal made punctuation marks, commas, breaths where he could. When Viserion's wing clipped the Tower of Old Bells, the bell itself spoke once against its own iron will, and then fell into the yard and killed a man who had never believed in dragons in his life until both killed him in a breath. The blue dragon wheeled and wheeled again. He was lighter in the air and more easily cunning. The living dragons had weight, and weight is its own kind of sense. On the ground, the dead foot pressed the breach where the fire had turned to glass. Where the glass had not cooled, it took them, fused them into art. Jon saw a man in armor made of ice, and the ice had flowed through the links and the rings and had made him forever standing in motion. He had wondered once, in the naive way of a boy who had not yet died and come back, whether beauty would survive any of it. He had his answer: beauty would insist on itself even in this. He sliced the head from a dead thing that had been a baker with a roll still frozen in his hand. The sword took the head clean. The head rolled. The roll rolled. Jon kicked the roll into the flame and for a moment watched it blacken and then collapse like a thing giving up the ghost of its own leaven. Then he went to work. They held the breach because men can hold more than they think when they are held by something larger than themselves. They held it with spears that had been boiled in oil and had bits of dragonglass hammered into them with love and hurry. They held it with short swords and long memories. They held it with Davos's curses and Davos's hand where he did not hold a blade but held a boy's elbow and turned him the right way so he did not die. They held it with Arya's knife flickering like a thought men forget how they came by. They held it with the raw hatred of fire that the dead have in them, a hatred men borrowed like heat and threw back in their faces. They held because Daenerys's red line did not fail them, because Drogon remembered for her when she could not and wrote it in the air again and again until words ceased meaning and all that was left was breath and flame. And then, without any signal except that the world could not bear another pass of it, the dead fell back. Not far, not with panic, like a tide that recedes because it must. They stood beyond the relit breach and stared. John could not see their eyes, but he knew their focus by the way the cold crept again into his joints and wrapped a hand around his heart and squeezed gently, the way a nursemaid will test a boy's chest for a cough. He thought, they will try the water now. He thought, they will freeze it where it is thickest and push their weight on it the way a winter knows a pond. He thought, we have bought a day to teach the living to leave. He sank to a knee in the yard because the yard had become a body and was rocking in his vision. He became aware that he had blood on him. He could not say where he had got it. It had become a thing he wore like a garment. He shook his head as a dog shakes water off. The dog will still be wet. Men gathered around him, drawn not by his name but by the space he took up. Tyrion with hands burnt with rope, the skin peeled at the heel of his palm. Davos with a cut along the wrist that ran in two directions where someone had slashed and someone else had clapped a hand there in kindness and the blade had caught both. Arya with a tear in her sleeve and a face without a mark as if winter had made her porcelain finally. Daenerys landed behind them. She slid down not with grace this time but with the care of a woman whose legs might not trust her. Her hair had burned at the ends to a frizz that even a queen cannot will back to beauty. She came to Jon. The men moved aside because there are things even a war cannot deny to others. She put both her hands on his cheeks with a savage possessiveness and looked into him as if she could take him apart and see if the broken things were in the right places. I did it, she said, but it was a question. You did, he said. And you, she said, and there was no word after it because he had done the thing that had no short name. He pulled her in then, as a man who has been in 5 fights in a row pulls a friend under a roof to keep the rain off for a count of 30. They allowed the embrace to write a little light into the dark, and then they separated because men were watching and needed the light, not the privacy. Jon straightened. He turned to the wall and to the men on it and to the city beyond, and he found the voice that the day had not burned away. We hold until the sea freezes, he said. We load until there is no one left to load. We burn again when the fire thins. We do not run from the lines. We do not break the pace for bread. We do not stop to mourn the dead because the dead do not need it and the living do. We do not hate the man beside us because he has a different God. Gods give weather and we have weather enough. Look at me. He paused until those who needed to had looked away and then back and then found him despite themselves. Look at me. I will be here while you do it. In a city of 1,000,000 souls, there are 1,000 stories moving at any hour like threads in a loom. That night the loom took flame and still the threads moved. A Septon carried a girl down a stair until his back broke, and another man took her and did not ask what God had approved of that. A gold cloak who had seen 100 men hang for lesser crimes than he had committed in a day swam out with a rope in his teeth to pull a boat off a sandbar. A butcher lifted the gate for a noblewoman's cart because the guard had fallen asleep on his feet and he could not wake him gently, not with a war in his ears. A woman in a shawl with old red in it found a corner with 2 walls and a roof and spread her body over 3 children who were not hers because the cold was biting at their faces and she had seen hunger and worse weather than this and knew how to share. Arya went where the gaps were and made them smaller. Davos found bread when there was no bread by taking down a tapestry that had hidden rats for a century and roasting the rats and telling men a story that made them grin through grease. Tyrion drank cold water and it hurt his teeth and he laughed because even pain could be a thing to count. Toward dawn the wind changed. It had been coming steady out of the north, straight and true as a soldier's stare. It veered east and with it the cold took the sea by the spine. A thin lace formed between boats, pretty as a maiden's cuff in a tale. Then it thickened. Men broke it with oars, and it reknitted. It would take the day, and then the bay, and then the men on the last quays would be frozen in their working clothes with hands out. Jon saw the patterns form. He turned to Daenerys. He did not need to ask. We will take the last 2 wards now, she said. There was blood at the corner of her mouth again. It had dried to a beautiful brown. He wanted to wipe it with the back of his finger. He did not. We will not leave the Red Keep for last. It goes with the rest. He shook his head once. Leave the granaries. The dead do not eat. The living do, she said. And we are living. He should have thought of that. That he had not made him feel weary enough to sleep standing. The granaries, he said. They took a last line along the hill of Rainies and left gashes of red where men had built with wood because wood was quicker and cheaper and looked beautiful in the sun. They spared stone where they could not spare life. The dragons flagged. The city burned in ways that had nothing to do with dragons now. Fire has a mind when you feed it. The dead reached and Arya ched again. Vizirian made his blue line where he could, but even ice grows tired. Even hate must rest. Jon watched them both tire, the fire and the ice, and felt something take a shaky breath inside him that might have been hope or its evil twin. By full morning, if morning could be called the scraping of weak light on the underside of a cloud, there was a space between the dead and the living that would take half a day to cross through ash and heat. The living had boats enough one more time. The living had a patience that could be counted in how many times a mother will not slap a hand from a loaf although her child is crying. The living had a man who would wear what they threw at him later and call it a coat with which to walk into cold. The living had 2 dragons whose hides smoked like baths in winter. They went on. There is no end to it in a day. There is barely a pause. In that pause, Jon went alone up to the roof between 2 towers where the stone had taken on a skin of something slick as eel. He stood looking down at what he had made. It looked like a map a mad girl had drawn with a coal when told to draw a castle. It looked like 1,000 other things that would not come to him now because the mind closes small doors to keep larger ones open. The door behind him opened. He did not turn. He knew by the idea of the footfall who it was and by the smell. Fire that had been sweet at first and was now merely chemical and sad. Tyrion came and stood at his shoulder as if there had been a long, ancient idea that men stand that way when something must be seen by 2. They stood without speaking for the time it takes a kettle to boil. Then Tyrion said, "I am drafting sentences." "Draft them," Jon said. "About why this had to be done," Tyrion said. "About why you were the only man who could have ordered it and remain who he is in the ordering. About how we will never speak of it in any other way except that way because the other way is a door no one can close once it is opened." He looked sideways. "I am devising how to forgive you so that I may live with you. This is an unseemly admission." Jon let the wind pull the hair away from his face and then set it back again like hands. "Do not forgive me because you like me," he said. "Forgive me if you can because it will save lives." "It will save mine," Tyrion said dryly. "I do not eat fear well. It gives me indigestion." Jon almost smiled and then did not. He put his hands into his cloak and touched his own ribs as if to count them and see if they were still there. "There will be a day after this," he said in a low voice. "If we live, it will be a day like any day, with muddy streets and a man cutting his finger on a wine jar and a child with a sore tooth. On that day, I will try to begin again." "Do you think the day will allow it?" Tyrion asked gently. "I will not ask it," Jon said. "I will put my back against it and see if it moves." They went down again because men were calling and because the day does not stop bending you to its work because you have had a thought. The work was smaller now and therefore harder. Finding the ones who had hidden where they should not. Making the ones who had resisted go where they must. Cooling tempers that boiled even in this air. Deciding whether to open the gates for the last 100 who beat on them or to set that gate alight to keep the dead from finding a convenience. Jon said no to a lordling and yes to a wench and did not confuse the two. He told Davos to take a boat that had no business in a war and make it a war boat by virtue of stubbornness. He told Arya to go to the Sept and pull any children out, and if the Septons called it a profanation to tell them Jon Snow had said the gods might carry men, but Arya Stark carried children, and to say this like a jest so it would be remembered as kindness. He asked Daenerys to come down from the saddle and drink water that had been boiled and cooled. She did and made the face of a child forced to take a draught. He put his hand under her elbow, found the tremor again. "I will fly before dark," she said. "There will be a time when it makes the last difference." "There will," he said. "Do you love me?" she asked simply. It was a question from some other life, obscene here, perfect. It made the cold feel briefly like a thing that could be offended. I love you, he said, and the word love felt like something too new for this day, like green under snow, like bread when men have eaten ash so long they call it meat. I love you, and I will ask you to do worse before we are done. She did not flinch. It was not in her. She nodded once, the sovereign gesture of a woman who had learned to say yes to things she never would have imagined a decade before and to live anyway. Then I will do it, she said. And I will let you live with me after in a house by the sea that does not catch fire, and I will watch you sleep badly, and I will forgive you in small ways that feel like a rope around your chest loosening. We will not speak of this day. I will not stand it if we name it too often. John lowered his head at that, because to be told the shape of mercy in that form was a kind of pain he would still pay for. The dead did what he had guessed then. They went to the water in lines, and they made the water an idea more than a thing. A skin formed. Men in boats took poles and pushed, and the skin cracked and the boat slid, and then the skin formed again behind them. The dead came onto it and kept coming, and their weight became the argument ice needed to be a bridge. Davos shouted until his voice broke and then made himself understood with hands. The last 100 on the quays ran not like frightened men but like men who could count. They got on the last boat. When that boat moved, the quays were empty of living men. John nodded once to the men with the oil and the men with torches, and they did what men who have been told to do a thing do when a man they have chosen has told them firmly and without cruelty. They set the quays on fire. The flames licked up old pitch and new pine and made a barrier. The dead came onto it and stood in the light and, for a heartbeat, were beautiful again. Men in armor, women with hair that had been braided for a feast. Before the heat took them apart into the separate things they had been made of: ice, bone, grief. Night folded back over all of it because fire eats air and leaves shadow. Drogon and Regal went up again because they had to. Viserion came with his new monarchy of cold, and the air became a battlefield again, not of kings and banners but of physics, of elements that had been enemies since the first morning anything cooled and then was heated. John found that, as he watched, he was no longer seeing dragons. He was watching lines and counters, and this made him both capable and sick. He did not look away. He did not hold anyone's hand. The world was enormous, and he was a small thing in it, and he had just burned a city, and he could still make a dent in the next hour. That is what he held. Sometime in the long part of the night where dawn is promised but seems a cheat, the noise slackened. Fire dropped to coals. Ice paused as if listening. Men slept with their heads against walls and their mouths open, and women slept with their legs drawn up under their skirts and their hands over their bellies as if to remind their bodies to go on. Davos slept sitting up with his jaw working as if he chewed bread in his dreams. Tyrion slept with his hand inside his shirt as he had learned to do as a boy, so if a man came he would have a knife mean enough to make him hesitate. Arya did not sleep where anyone could say they had seen her sleeping. Daenerys did not sleep. She watched the line. Jon did not sleep. He counted the breaths he took and made sure there was no gap between any two that could let anything in that would break him. When dawn came, meaner than the one before, a light that did not care for what it illuminated, men woke to the sight of ashfall that had come in the night like a blessing and dressed everything in equal gray. Red tiles wore it and old gold and men's beards. The dead stood on the far side of the fire as if they had been listening to a long sermon and now would rise to sing. The dragons came down to earth with the piety of exhausted gods. A gull cried, one gull, and flew low over the bay and then away, as if to say, I am not gone. Jon looked at the line and at the city and at the faces around him, and he understood that he had done a thing that would make a long shadow. He understood, too, that the shadow would be useful for a while. A shadow can be shade. Men can rest in it before they go on. Davos came to him. He had in his hand a piece of bread half-eaten and did not seem aware of that. We bought a day, he said. We will spend it, Jon said. We will spend it well, Davos said. And in those words was the sailor's religion. Tyrion appeared with a parchment crumpled in his fist. I have written it. It will do for now. He looked at Jon with eyes that had found their old ability to find humor in fear and use it like a blade. I have not yet called you savior. I will save that for when you truly deserve it. Do not ever call me that, Jon said, not in anger, but with a weariness that came from a bone deeper than marrow. "Call me the man who stayed." "I will," Tyrion said. "And after we live, I will have a drink that costs more than this city is now worth, and I will tell a girl with eyes the color of olive oil that I saw you once and you were not as tall as she has read." Arya brushed past them then with a smear of soot on her cheek that made her look even younger than she was. "The sept is empty," she said. "The old woman in the red shawl went with 3 children. She gave me the shawl because it is unlucky for her and lucky for me." Jon closed his eyes and opened them. He saw red stitched with old hands into pattern. He saw a boy with gray wool who could run. He saw a dragon's flame taught to be a wall. He saw a day that would not end here, and he made himself begin it again. He turned to the lines drawn in ash and flame and men and said, "Again." They did it again, and again after that. The city was not a city, and the winter was not a season, and the war was not a story yet, only the making of one. In that making, Jon discovered new parts of himself that were good and ugly and necessary. He discovered that mercy could be measured not only in spared lives but in spared looks, in the refusal to say an easy truth that would make a wound worse. He discovered that love can be a woman's hand on your cheek 3 times in a day at 3 different hours, and each time the only thing in the world. He discovered that guilt is a muscle, and if you use it rather than let it use you, it grows strong and carries weight as well as pain. By noon, if noon can be said about a day that has ceased to be divided in any meaningful way, the living had dwindled in the city to a number that was a number again and not a color. The ones left were men whose jobs were to close things and then open them again somewhere else, and men who had been wounded and could not walk and would not be carried because they had decided not to, and women who had made a place for themselves in a corner that had not burned, and priests who had found a piece of their god in a crack of stone and could not be moved from it. Jon went to each in turn and learned what he could learn from them, and then put his hand to their shoulder or did not. He sent messages to ships. He received none because ships have their own time. He stood with Daenerys at the lip of the world and watched winter put its foot down again. He did not speak. He had said everything. She did not speak. The fire in her had gone inward for now. They shared a silence that was not empty but full of the sound of things they could not name and did not need to. Toward evening, Viserion came and wrote a blue line across a section of fire that had been neglected for an hour because men had been busy living. Drogon rose as if jerked by a string and cut a bright answer. Regal, stubborn and joyful and in pain, made a 3rd line and then sank slowly until his belly touched ash and lay there like a black hill breathing. The dead probed the gap as a finger probes a tooth. They found the pain and withdrew, patient as a winter. Somewhere a song began. It was not a song of the faith. It had a lilt Jon knew from the part of the world where women spend long nights with wool and men with knives. It was a northern song, and it came so unsurely at first he thought it a trick of the wind. Then it found itself. Others joined it. The words were about a woman who waited at a window for a man who would not return, and about a bird that promised news and never came. The men who sang it were Southerners mostly and did not know the words. They learned them fast. Tyrion listened and closed his eyes and swayed as if to the memory of a tavern. Davos did not sing. He never had. Arya did not sing. She never would. Daenerys did not sing. The sound of it did something to her face Jon could not read. He did not sing either. He let the song find him anyway and go in. When the light failed and the ash in the air made halos around small lamps and made the dragons look like the gods of a smaller, kinder people painted on old walls, Jon said, "We will eat." And they did, with hands, with knives, with mouths that opened painfully because they had been clenched too long. They ate bread that had been baked in an oven that had once made wedding cakes. They ate meat that tasted faintly of smoke and always would. They drank water and wine when they could find it and did not count how much. They sat with their backs to stones and put their chins on their knees and watched the flame lines pulse like veins. They kept watch with shifts so even a king took his turn, and when Jon's came he stood and looked out and remembered the night he had died and thought, "I am more alive now, finally, than I was when I had a whole heart." He had not made his peace. It was not a peace day, but he had made a map in fire that might be followed. He had refused to give the dead a city full of voices to use against the living. He had accepted a hatred that had not yet been spoken and would be. He had found in himself a man who could do a necessary wrong and go on without making a shrine of it. He had found a woman who would fly above a hell because he had asked her to and because she had asked herself first and said yes. He had found friends who would not forgive him quickly and would not leave. He had found that he could begin again and again after that until beginning was a kind of prayer. The night pressed its cold face against the wall. The fire answered. The sea held. The city he had killed held. The dead watched. The living breathed. The dragons slept a little, and in their sleep their mouths smoked like horses in winter. Somewhere a gull cried again. Somewhere a boy with a hole in his hem slept on a floor in a boat and dreamed of bread. Somewhere a woman with a shawl not red anymore put it over 3 children who were and were not hers. Somewhere a little god of a small house looked at a candle and decided to go on. When the first pale, hard line of dawn came between 2 roofs like a knife, John was standing where he had been standing all night. He felt the pressure of the world, and it did not crush him. He went to find Daenerys and found her already walking toward him, hair stiff with ash, eyes the color of new coins minted in a realm that had never known summer. They did not speak. They stood side by side and watched the day come, and when it did they nodded, each to the other and not for witnesses, and went to work. By the second dawn the ash on the hill had found seams in the stone and made them black. It had found lashes and eyebrows and made men look older and more the same. The wind had a new edge to it. It carried nothing loose. No paper, no straw, no birds. It carried only cold like a law. John had stood at the southern parapets while the world made up its mind, and when it did he felt it as a pressure in his ears the way a storm arrives to sailors before it shows a single white line on the sea. He raised his arm and the orange-sashed men on the quays below raised theirs and the lines of people began to move again, steady, almost indifferent now, like water finding its arranged channels. Davos appeared beside him with the expression of a man who has seen his own future in bad weather and made his peace with it. "The bay is skinning over," he said. "Not all at once. It's patchwork, slick as an eel. Easy to break in front of a bow, treacherous to a man's confidence." "Confidence kills," John said. "Caution too if it buys you nothing. Keep them together. Don't let any man decide he knows better than the boat in front of him." Davos did not nod so much as not disagree. "I've set 2 galleys to lead like old cows. Even fools will follow a cow when they're freezing." He squinted toward the east, where the silhouette of Dragonstone was an ink mark pressed hard into the horizon. "If we get them out beyond the mouth, we can tack for Rosby and Duskendale. The river folk can hug the shore up past Sow's Horn. I don't like it, but then there's nothing left to like." John looked over his shoulder toward the inner city where the lines of fire lay like veins under skin. "We'll like it when it's done," he said, and heard how empty that sounded in his own throat, as if the words had been dried by too much use. Tyrion had taken to wearing a scarf tied up over his mouth and nose like a bandit, and on a smaller man it might have made him comic, but his eyes did not allow for that. "I have a notion," he said, arriving with parchment rolled into his palm as if it were a stick and he could beat sense into the day with it. "Not a clever one, merely workable. If it isn't clever, I will like it more," John said. "The wildfire the alchemists have hidden in their cellars." Tyrion watched John's face. "Yes, I know you said no to it. This is not for the streets. This is for the bay. They have casks loaded onto old hulks anchored out beyond the quays, meant to defend the harbor mouth if, say, an armada of enemies ever wished to visit without knocking. If we sink 3 or 4 of those with their cargoes, the green fire will sit on the water and make a heat the ice will not easily claim. It buys time. It makes lanes. It may even make the dead think twice about trying the water there." Davos's face went long in the mouth. "Wildfire is not a tool. It's a thing with its own mind, and it's a bad one. It is a mind we can set to the same direction as ours for an hour," Tyrion said. "I dislike the taste of the suggestion more than you do, Ser Davos. But I also dislike frozen boats with mothers and children in them. And I dislike the idea of the dead simply crossing the bay because we have graciously laid out a smooth, shining bridge." John could taste green in the back of his throat from the mere thought. The remembered tale of men turned hour-long candles, of the way it clung and did not let go. He thought of Daenerys dropping fire like law across the streets and how even that had seemed clean compared to this. "If we do this," he said, "we will keep the lead boats clear of the slick. No one will find out what it means to have green flame catch in a sail while the oars are still out. And I want no sparks inshore. The keys burn enough as it is." "I can do it," Davos said in the tone of a man who has been saddled with igniting hells before. "I won't like it, but liking is a luxury." Tyrion's eyes hooded momentarily with what might have been relief. "I will find the keys to the vaults, and the men to row the poor monsters out. There is a fellow among the alchemists who enjoys his work far too much. Perhaps we can persuade him to enjoy it in a way useful to us without letting him breed." He turned the scarf down to drink something that steamed and then put the cloth back as if to keep words and breath both from escaping. Jon left them to it and made for the inner stairs. In the yard below, Regal stood with his wings twitching, a horse's skin trying to shake flies in a season that had none. The wound at the shoulder where a shard of ice had grazed him the night before had split in flying. It leaked an ichor the color of old iron and smelled like rain on hot sand. Drogon hulkied near the wall, half asleep and yet with the sense of a coiled spring in him. Dany was speaking quietly to two Dothraki who had stayed when the others took ship weeks ago, and Jon had to drag his mind back to a time when Dothraki in this courtyard would have been a wonder to him instead of a tool. She saw him before he spoke. Her eyes were rimmed in raw. "Tell me, Tyrion wants wildfire in the bay," Jon said. She flinched as if that word alone carried heat. Then she shook it off. "If it buys an hour, we pay. I will keep high while they light it. I will keep my own fire ready if it climbs the wrong rope." She looked over his shoulder toward the sea where you could see a few hunched black shapes that were waiting ships. "I have become a keeper of fires, Jon." She said it in a voice that was not self-pitying and not proud. "I always thought I would be the fire itself." "You are," he said. "You are both now." She breathed out through her nose and it smoked in the cold like a dragon's thought. "There's an old woman in the kitchens," she said as if the words had been wanting to leave for a while. "She told me a story just now while we waited for the meat to thaw. When the Mad King put his hands on her husband's face and burned it to the bone for saying that good bread was better than cold meat. She kept working in the kitchens because work was what she knew to do. She said the sound of the king's breath was worse than the sound of the man dying. It was wet, and she said it was not the king's cruelty that ruined her, but that wet sound. She didn't know why she told me. Neither do I." She lifted her chin. "We will do this and I will live with it until I cannot. That will not be today." He wanted to take her wrist and feel the small bones under the ash and tell her they were still hers. He did not. There was too much looking to be done and too much instruction. "Keep to the east above the water when they light it," he said. "If Viserion comes, draw him out over it if you can. If not, pull him away from the lanes. And if you see me on the wall lifting my hand twice, that is your sign to lay fire at the Lion Gate. The dead are pressing there. The glass is thin." She nodded once. "And you?" "I will do what I told them I would do," he said, and went, because the words themselves were a weight and he couldn't carry them any longer without putting them down in work. Arya was waiting in the narrow passage behind the armory, where the stone had sweated in the night and still did. She had a bundle under her arm. She thrust it at him. "Gloves. Better ones," she said. "I stitched leather into the palms." He pulled his own off and took the bundle. The gloves were cunningly made, thicker where a man's hand meets stone, lighter at the fingers so he could still feel his sword. "You learned this in the House of Black and White," he said, trying to shape it as a jest and hearing how childish it was even as it came out. "I learned to use my time," she said, "and to watch how things wear. You wear your palms on the stone too much." He slid them on and the fit was honest and patient. "Thank you," he said to her, and that too was insufficient to what he felt she had been to him in the last 2 days. A knife that went where he could not. "Don't use wildfire on people," she said, and for the first time there was a thin line of plea in her voice, tension pulled across a frame. "If you can avoid it, Styx. I saw it once." "I will not," he said. "The bay only." She studied him with that fierce, unblinking gathering gaze she had had as a child when she decided if she hated a thing or would take it home. Then she nodded once and vanished rather than leaving, the way she did, as if the air had taken her in. By the time the bells marked the hour, unsteady, off in their old wounds, men were already rowing the hulks out. They were ugly boats, square, fat, their decks sagging. The alchemist Tyrion had spoken of, a graybeard with eyes too clear, stood aboard one, cradling a copper stick with bells soldered at the end. He looked like a delighted child at a fair. Davos had set 2 of his best oarsmen to that hulk, and he stood in the bow of another with a long pole like a farmer tending cattle. Jon hated everything about the picture and forced himself to watch every stroke and tuck of sail, as if the watching alone were a spell that could keep them from disaster. At the lip of the quay, a woman with a baby tied to her breast stopped, turned back, and stared toward the hill of Baelor as if she had left something holy behind. One of the orange-sashed men tapped her shoulder, gentle as a brother. She wiped her nose, nodded, and went again. Jon saw the way her head moved and knew she would never reach for that gesture in her mind without finding Ash there too. The first hulk slid to a halt when the ice caught at its belly. Men leaned into the oars and the oars flexed and held. Davos called without the whip of anger, with the even pull of a command that spoke to muscles more than fear. The hull creaked through. Tyrion's scarfed head appeared at Jon's elbow and did not startle him because he had expected him now at all moments when something ugly happened and words might be required. "You should be somewhere else," Jon said without looking. "I should," Tyrion said. "And I will be when not being here would make it no worse to stay away." The alchemist lifted his bell and stick once they had gone beyond the line of keys, and Jon's hands gripped the stone because the urge to shout no was a physical need. Davos raised his pole. The bell and stick came down. Green opened like a flower that hated itself. It flared and then relaxed and spread in all directions, silent for a heartbeat that was as cruel as any shriek. Then it spoke in its wet, hungry voice. Men on the quays drew back without being told. The second hulk lit as a boy might light a second taper off a first without quite meaning to. Davos spun his boat with an oar like a sword and vanished into the steam and reappeared with his jaw set as if he would chew the ocean. The ice retreated. It did so with reluctance and with noise, cracked and screamed and curled and fell back under the green's persuasion. Smoke rose in 2 colors now, black and a sickly pale that was not any smoke a man should breathe. Jon felt it settle on his tongue as if the day had decided to brand him there too. "Time," Tyrion said tightly, eyes fixed on the water the way a drinker watches the level fall in his cup. "Buy us time, you bastard." It did. The lanes between the green slicks steamed, and boats slid through them like fish. The lead galley struck the thin edge of newborn ice and broke it with its blunt confidence, and the boats behind followed that confidence like a road. Men did not cheer. There was not breath to be wasted, and no lesson to be taught by Solace now. Daenerys went up with Drogon to keep the lanes honest. Rhaegal followed a heartbeat later, like a scribe correcting a first draft. Viserion did not show himself for a quarter of an hour, and in that quarter Jon found his thoughts begin to put flesh on the idea that perhaps the dead were slow to use their greatest weapon. Then the blue came, a seam splitting the sky. It lanced down over the further of the 2 green fields, and for an instant the blue and the green met and made a thing that had no place in nature, a whiteness so intense it ate the color around it. The green hissed and roared and contracted like a living thing trying to pull its skirts away from a sewer. The ice reached back toward it with greedy fingers. Drogon shot through that place and wrote red on it with contempt. Viserion wheeled and dropped too low and his jaw clipped the green, and the noise he made threw men to the boards of their ships, not by volume but by meaning. It was the cry of a beast that remembers heat as a pleasure and has been handed a parody of it. He flung himself into clean, cold air again and circled, spraying sheets of blue that froze and shattered and fell. Rhaegal went high and came down on that shower to melt it with a roar that was all pain and pride. In the inner city, a runner came to Jon with ice in his eyebrows and hands bleeding from where he had fallen twice. "The dead at the Lion Gate," he said, words too large for his mouth. "They are climbing the glass. It breaks and they climb again. The fire there is thin. John's breath hurt at the bottom of his ribs. He raised his arm once, twice, slow so that no one on the wall would mistake him. Drogon broke from his fight with the winter above the bay as if he had been watching for that signal all along and streaked like the idea of a sword over the hill. He dragged a line across the Lion Gate and another beyond it to give it depth. And the men below that gate threw themselves to the stones because even loyalty to a queen's plan can have a man's flinch in it. The dead spilled from the glass like grain from a split sack and lay very still where they fell, and after a breath a few twitched because hatred has its own rules. The line held again. The gate steamed, and then the steam turned to beautiful crystals along the upper lintels, and the crystals cracked and fell. Delicate failure. That would have been pretty in another life. Down in the yard, Arya moved like a stitch through cloth, making a hem where life would fray. She had a squad of 5 boys, mostly, and one woman with strong shoulders and a scar that made a parenthesis from mouth to ear. She sent them to where men were not looking and where women were too proud to ask. She came to Jon only when she had something that had to be held in another hand. "There are White Walkers in the Ash Alley," she said, and showed no curiosity that the alley had acquired that name in a night. "Not many, too. The whites with them move cleaner and faster. If we cut one, the bodies behind us drop like sacks. If we get both, we might buy a space wide enough to get 6 carts through." "Take 10 men," Jon said. "Davos can spare no one from the keys. Take the quiet ones." "I already have them," she said, and was gone. And somewhere a woman told a child the story of the way a girl vanishes and saves a city and does not ask for thanks, though they did not yet know how the story would end, only that it had begun. Tyrion returned from the harbor with green on his boots and rage lodged in his voice. "If I had sense," he said, "I would have drowned that alchemist years ago when he smiled at me and talked about progress. If I live, I will drown him after saving him thrice." "If you live," Jon said, and did not soften it, because the day had despised softness and taken advantage of it when offered. "How long does the green burn?" "Longer than anyone deserves." Tyrion rubbed his eyes and left a smear of something foul there. "Davos has turned the hulks to windward, keeps the smoke blown away from the lanes. We will have a while. I find I am inventing new measurements for time that have nothing to do with bells. A while, a bit, a breath." Men ran with water to the dragons when they came down for lulls. The water hissed on their hides. Rhaegal submitted to hands the way a horse does when rider and beast have come to an agreement neither will betray for a day. Drogon tolerated nothing, and men learned fast to dump and run. Daenerys drank from a leather that had been filled so many times it had a permanent crease. She did not wipe her mouth when she was done. She ate a wedge of bread and meat as if they were one thing. She did not speak to anyone for that while and then began to speak again in short, decisive phrases as if the food had bought her words. In the ash alley where Arya had taken her 10, Frost made a neat seam along the middle of the lane as if a seamstress had been exacting with blue thread. The walkers were quiet, and this quiet was an insult. They stood like a pair of elegant men surveying a place they meant to own. Their spears were long and delicate as fish bones. The wind at their backs moved in pulses, as if they breathed deep and seldom. Arya waited until one turned the fraction of a head, and then she and her quiet men slipped from shadow to shadow like thoughts a man refuses to acknowledge when he is tired. She came up under the halberd of a gold cloak who had been frozen standing and used him as a screen to cover her last 2 steps. She went for the back of the knee of the nearest walker, because the back of the knee is a truth about bodies whether bone is dead or not. The small blade in her right hand sang no song, but it hummed its education. It met the back of that icy knee and went in as if it had been invited. The walker did not scream. It did not fall in the way of men. Folded. Arya reversed grip and drove upward under the joint of the hip, exactly where a seam would be if such things had seams, and she did not let the blade snag. The second walker pivoted with a grace that made her angry and beautiful at once. And a boy with a flail took its spear on the chain and not in his belly because long practice with chickens had taught him to catch things. The woman with the scar went low and hamstrung the walker without thinking about the words ham and string and how they might taste today. When the second one turned to crush the woman's skull with the butt of its spear, Arya slid under the arc of that blow and put her blade at the tenderness above its breastbone, where even a thing made of winter must have some delicate break to admit motion. The blade went in. The sound that followed was not a cry but a sigh, as of something coming home too late. Both fell in manners that will be argued about by old men who were not there, and the whites behind them softened and sagged as if their ropes had been cut. 6 carts went down the alley. A runner brought Jon that news, and it was one of the few reports that made his chest lift instead of sink. He lifted his hand in a sign he and Arya had made as children. 2 fingers, then a crooked third, knowing she would not see it and feeling it mattered to make it anyway. He realized he was doing many things like that, throwing away small gestures into the day like coins into a poor man's hand because it was the only currency that felt true. Toward afternoon, if a color can be called a time, the wind died. It did not shift or veer. It stopped. The smoke hung. Sound grew thick. Men found it harder to call across short distances because their voices found the air heavy and did not travel. The green fire in the bay went on eating and the ice went on knitting itself nearby, and the 2 conditions made a geometry that would have pleased a cold mathematician and offended a poet. Jon's eyes burned. He realized he had not blinked for longer than any man should. He closed them and opened them, and the world had moved 3 inches, the way it does when a man doing figures misses a line on the page. Davos limped up the steps to him because one ankle had turned on ice and refused to bear his full weight now without complaint. "We can give you 1 more hour of departures," he said. "After that the ice wins, or the green gets uglier than even the gods can stand." 1 hour, Jon said. "We spend it. We spend everything," Davos said without bitterness, as if narrating a law. They set the last wards moving like a slow dance done by the old to a rhythm they can keep. Men with pipes cut from cane blew notes when a lane opened and notes when it closed. Women with blankets made of curtains and cushions moved in clumps that made sense only to them and to the children inside. Tyrion walked with a staff, not because he needed one but because men get out of the way for a man with a staff. He used it to hook at the ankles of those who shoved where shoving would do no good, to prop a boy who had fallen asleep standing up, to trip a man who had decided this would be the hour to be brave and stupid both. He muttered to himself and sometimes to the gods and sometimes to Jon, who could not hear him and heard him anyway. Daenerys took Drogon up again, and Jon saw the moment when the lash of light hit her face as they rose into the smoke, and she fell through it into clear air over the bay and could breathe for 10 heartbeats without ash. He loved her then with an ache that was not romantic and not merely human, but like a small and hard stone placed in his chest and left there as a weight to keep him steady. Rhaegal pushed after her, dutiful and angry and full of need. The pair of them found Viserion in the white glare beyond the green and began the old argument again. Heat saying live, cold saying stop, and neither able to persuade the other, only to shout. A spear of ice took a man beside Jon in the throat. It did not come from a walker in the alley, those were dead. It came from far, thrown with a cool precision that made beauty of murder. The man fell as if a kettle had been set on his head and someone had blown out the candle under it. Jon looked up and saw the shape standing like a statue on the far, low rooftop beyond the Lion Gate breach. He could not tell if it was the one who commanded the rest or one of his high lieutenants. He had learned not to use the word king for his enemies when kings were down among them doing work. The walker raised its arm again. The motion was smooth, neither fast nor slow. It did not need to be. Jon dropped and the second spear sang over him and struck the wall and exploded into 1,000 needle points that a man could not shield against and would feel for hours as itch and burn and then fever. 3 men went down and 1 did not rise, and the other 2 cursed like men and got up. "Archers," Jon said. He had almost said a name, Ed, but remembered and did not. And in that small aversion to his old self there was a grief that will last him if he sees 100 more winters. "Dragonglass tips," he said, "because not all men reach for the right quiver when a habit is older than a truth." The line of archers along the inner parapet fixed, adjusted, bent their backs into the bows and loosed. The first volley looked good and fell insufficient. The second took one of the walker's companions through the eye, and it shattered like the top of a lake under a weighted step. The third sent the one who had thrown the spear leaping sideways to a lower roof with an ease that would have been admirable if it had belonged to a dancer. John marked him with his eyes the way a hunter does when he knows he will have one chance later and does not wish to waste it in imagining shots now. He did not think about what the walker marked in him. He chose to pretend the enemy saw him as a stain on stone, easily washed. The last hour was the longest, as the last of anything worthy is. The boats took those who would let themselves be taken. Men with reasons to stay made their reasons into laws. A mason refused to leave because his father's bones were in the crypt beneath a chapel that had not burned. A boy refused because his dog would not get on the boat and he would not leave the dog. A woman refused because she had been promised years ago that she would die within sight of the sept's 7 stars. The sept had no stars now. John let men decide their own forms of dignity when the cost was theirs alone. He took the ones who hesitated and pushed them until the choice to live was taken out of their hands and gifted to them like a theft. He watched 2 men carry a third whose leg had been cut and would never be the same. He watched Arya come back from somewhere with snow in her hair that had not fallen from the sky. When the last boats pushed back with long poles and left the quays empty but for men wit, torches and the spoils of a century of trade turned to junk, John turned his face to the city and felt the work change shape. It had been about leaving. It became about staying. He drew the men back by layers, as one draws sheets from a bed where an old man lies. He put Tyrion on the south gate where the road dropped toward the fish ponds and would be treacherous in ice and better held by words than steel. He put Davos where his eye could see both the green slick and the ice beyond it and decide which evil to feed at any moment with his thin prayers. He put Arya nowhere and everywhere and told himself not to keep glancing, a useless habit like licking a tooth that hurts. He put himself at the Red Keep's inner wall where the stone had been eaten by Dragonfire in places and left to cool and now had the strength of glass. The dead came again at dusk in a line that had none of the clumsiness of earlier. They had learned the streets, or else the cold had whispered them better routes. They found a seam under the hill of Visenya where 2 fires met and did not marry well. They poured through in a narrow spout that widened as more pushed. John took the first 10 with a joyless efficiency. Davos took the second with a boat hook that became a staff. Arya came from nowhere and cut 3 and vanished before the 4th fell. Tyrion struck one across the teeth with his staff and shouted a joke into its face that no one heard and no one would have laughed at if they had. The line shrank because lines do when you put your body in them with purpose. Drogon came down upon that seam and pressed his jaw to the ground and breathed, and the stone reddened and then flowed like fat, and the whites near it melted at the edges like candles left near a hearth. Regal found the high line above the same seam and made a roof of fire that dripped like stalactites of light. Between the two there was a place no man would wish to stand, and men did not wish it, and the dead could not wish, and that was the difference that mattered right then. Viserion struck back at the dragons themselves, not at the ground, and his blue drove Regal sideways into a wall of smoke, and Jon's heart went with him into that cloud and stayed there until a green-black head punched out again, trailing steam and fury. Drogon caught Viserion broadside and shoved him with a brutal, beautiful application of weight that belonged to things that had fought under other rules before men were a story. Viserion banked and fled higher, and Dany took Drogon after him, and Jon read in the set of her back that for right now she had forgotten he existed, or anyone but the beast she meant to turn. He loved her for that. He hated the need that asked it of her. In the pause that followed, sound returned as if someone had cut a cloth that had muted it. Jon could hear the rasp of his own breath. He could hear a man sob quietly and not even know he did it. He could hear Tyrion say, "This is almost like a city again," and he could hear Davos answer, "A city is a place where you can be distracted. We have no distractions left. That is what is saving us." He could hear Arya's hand slide down the leather of her sheath in a sound so soft only a brother would have heard it. Night came with intention. The green dwindled in the bay to slicks with edges serrated like teeth. The ice grew around those teeth like gums that had decided to eat their own. The last boat passed the mouth of the harbor with men rowing and not looking back. The gull that had cried in the morning did not cry. Jon stood and stood again, and found that he could force himself to move by telling his foot the names of men he had lost and stepping once for each name. He told himself the story of Robb walking into a hall with banners and not knowing, and stepped. He told himself the story of Ygritte's laugh and stepped. He told himself the story of a boy whose name he did not know with a hole in his hem and stepped. The dead came at the Red Keep at midnight, not at the gates, but over the cliff face where men had imagined no one would climb. In a thin ribbon that had taken hours to make from ropes of sinew and wire, they came onto the outer terrace like ants. Arya saw them first because she had taken to watching where the world said, "That way is impossible." She hid a note on a small pipe she had stolen from a child in the square, and men moved to that note as if it meant food. Jon went with them, 2 steps at a time, until his legs did not belong to him, and then again when they remembered whose they were. They met the dead at the top, not with a crash but with a snapping like dry twigs, because the space was too small for splendor. There was a walker with them, thin, with a crown of frost that was not a crown and was simply the lie of light on ice. Jon did not wait for decorum. He pushed into that thin space with Longclaw held not as if it could save him by being famous, but as if it were a tool like any other. He parried the blow that was meant to take his wrist and felt the numb leap up his arm and bite his shoulder. He slid underneath and cut at the inside of the walker's thigh because he liked dishonorable places when the honorable ones had already failed him in his life more than once. The cut landed. It did not end the thing. He jabbed upward like a street rat with a stolen knife and aimed for a place just under the breastbone. The blade stuck. The cold came off the creature like an idea of godhood. Jon heard Arya's step behind him and did not turn because he knew if he did he would make a space in himself that might never close. He drove up with his legs and put his shoulder into the guard as if he were shouldering a door in a burning house. The walker's mouth opened. No sound came. Arya's blade appeared from the left, quick and mean, and found the walker's throat as one finds a seam in a sack by feeling. Came apart, not like breaking glass, not like breaking bone, but like breaking a promise. 100 bodies fell below in the dark like sacks. The line of climbers failed. 2 more came over the lip, and men with spears took them the way fishermen do when they are bored and the fish are obliging. Jon pressed his back to the stone and breathed, and the air felt like he was swallowing salt poured by a grudging hand. He looked at Arya, and she looked at him, and they did not speak because words were a new form of luxury and both were too poor. He slept then, he thinks he did, standing up with his eyes open and his sword down, for the space of a handful of heartbeats that went on for an hour. In that sleep he saw none of the things he feared and none of the things he wanted. He saw a wall of flame the height of 7 men and the color of ripe fruit, and he saw a field of ice the color of eyes that had loved him and then left him. He woke when a hand touched his bicep just above the elbow and found it was Daenerys, ash in her hair like powdered silver, and a way of moving that told him she had not known she had a body for a day and had found it again in surprise. "We have to choose," she said, voice very level, as if she were ordering breakfast. "We can hold here another day if we keep the lines hot. Or we can pull everything that breathes onto what ships remain and go to Dragonstone and make our stand there with sea around us and fewer streets to remember. If we stay, the dead will build a room in this city for themselves. If we leave, we give them a room anyway and perhaps choose one with smaller doors." She looked over his shoulder toward the bay where the green made the dawn a liar even before the sun had thought about trying. "I can make fire until I cannot. I don't know when that is." He thought of the granaries. He thought of the caches of dragonglass in the vaults they had made under the smithies and in the cloisters, arranged in careful piles by men who had been proud to shape something that would not break when cold told it to. He thought of the boats out in the bay with their decks full of lives' legs crowded so close you could not lay a coin between them. He thought of how he wanted to live next to her in a place where the wind did not have a mouth full of knives, and he thought of his oath spoken in a different voice to firelight and stone. "One more day," he said. "We hold one more day. Let the ships scatter to the mouths of rivers. We will fortify Dragonstone while we hold here. If we break to the sea and make the dead come over the water to take our last clean place." She studied him the way she had once studied a map and found in it a coastline where none had been drawn, and her eyes did a strange, lovely thing. They acknowledged his decision and also showed him the part of her that had made her want to say no. "One more," she said. "Then we go to the rock." He reached for her hand and found he could not make the gesture small. It was all his body wanted to do. He took her fingers and they were cold as wet stone. He said nothing because there was too much. She did not say anything either, and yet the space around them shifted as though both had spoken vows. Mourning under ash with a throat full of brass is not the same as mourning under mists. It is a kind of penance. Men began to count by little things because bells and shadows and food had all been taken as measures. A man said to another, "When your nose stops running, I will go to sleep." And that was time. A woman said, "After I finish this ladle," and that was time. The dragons lay with their heads side by side in the yard while water ran over their tongues, and that was time, too. The length of that stream, the way it steamed. Tyrion scratched at a blister until it broke, and that was also time, and he said aloud, because he could not help himself, "We are animals and clocks. It is good to be reminded." Jon set the fires again with the dragons, drew new lines over old, deepened the ones the dead had thinned under pressure of bodies. He sent men to break stairways and build traps, not to fight a street now but to bleed it of energy, to make the dead pay in inches and in boredom, if a bored thing can be bored. He ordered the last stores of grain hauled to the caves beneath the keep where the heat would not take them if the dragons needed to make a map there as well. He had a chair carried down and put at the mouth of that place for an old woman with a shawl that had once been red. She sat there and made a noise with her tongue that is not words and is comfort. At a lull he went to the skulls. It had been a superstition in the city that the old dragon skulls kept in their gallery were bad luck to look at when you had been at sea or at war. Men wanted to see the face of victory in polished iron, not the jawbone of a thing once mighty and now a museum. Jon walked among them and looked into their eyes anyway and found nothing there but the human trick of reading meaning into empty sockets. He stopped at Balerian's skull and put his hand on the black bone and felt the cold of it. He thought of the heat he had asked of living dragons and of the bones built of other fires. He thought, stupidly and with a kind of sad humor, that he would like to show Ghost this place so the wolf could lift his leg and make an honest comment. He smiled, a weak slash. The smile dried and flaked. Footsteps made no echo here because of the shape of the hall. Daenerys came like a memory, and for a blink he thought she might be a thing the skulls had conjured to comfort themselves with the sight of a cousin. She was not. She was very solid and very tired and perfectly herself. "When I was a girl," she said, "I dreamed of standing here and I would wake with my heart hammering and my mouth full of metal. I told myself the fear was a sign I was born to it. Then I told myself it meant I wasn't. Now I find it means both." She put her hand on Balerian's brow beside his and left it there until the cold began to hurt. "You're one more day," she said, not as a rebuke. "It is costing," he said. "I have never bought anything worth having cheaply," she said. "I do not trust bargains. I trust work." She turned her face enough that he saw the little smile that was the only safe softness on her now. "You should sleep for an hour. An hour is a day," he said. "Then sleep a day," she said, and made it a command. And he did the strange thing and obeyed because he suddenly understood that her orders were the only place where he could put down responsibility without the world rolling off the table. She led him by the elbow to a niche where the cold was at least honest and not fanged. He lay on a pallet and closed his eyes and fell into a sleep without dreams. A black that was kind, and woke with a man's voice saying his name the way a bell does when it has been struck by something heavier than a rope. Tormund's red beard filled the doorway when Jon opened his eyes, and for a moment he thought his mind was making jokes for him without his consent. He sat up, the world broke into points of light and took a moment to decide on a shape. "You aren't here," he said. "You are north of everything." Tormund said, smiling with all his cracked teeth. "And dragons aren't real, and women don't tell you the truth when they love you. Brothers shit snowflakes. What in the 7 burning arses has happened to your face?" Jon laughed because he could not help it and it hurt and that was good. He stood and he and the wildling clasped arms and hit each other's shoulders like men who have no patience for delicate salutations. Tormund smelled of seal fat and old sweat and relief. "How?" Jon asked. "How do men do anything?" Tormund said. Some died and some ran and some watched and learned and came to see if stupidity was what would save us this time. It won't, but I've always found it comforting. We came by boat in the night, little ones that kissed the shore. We followed your smoke. I have with me a few of the free folk who remember what it is to climb past things that tell you not to. And a gift. He reached behind him and hauled in a bundle wrapped in rough sacking. He pulled it back to show a half-barrel of dragonglass spearheads, neat as plums. Your little man told us where, months ago, and someone with fingers like foxes pulled a few loose without the spider knowing. I thought you might be handing out old iron by the handful down here. Dragonglass is a nicer sweet. John took the black point in his hand and felt the way it bent light and cold both. He loved Tyrion for a long ago letter that had taken and come back now like a pigeon finally willing to be caught. He loved Tormund for being alive. He walked with him back into ash and fire and gave the points to men whose hands had begun to think they would never hold anything new again. The dead came an hour later in a new way, from beneath. There are always tunnels in old cities, and rats and men share minds in these matters. Smoke rolled up from a grate in the cobbles near the iron gate, and the smoke was cold, and Davos, who had lived his life with an ear for the wrong sound, cocked his head and turned and saw a hand of ice push through the iron lattice like bread dough shoving its way through ill-kept holes. He bellowed and men stamped and stabbed and shoved torches down into the hole until a whistling rose from beneath the paving stones, and then a sound like something scratching at a door. They hauled the grates up and poured fire into the holes, and then they piled stones on them, and then they told themselves a story about how nothing could be under everything, and it helped because men are able to build a belief out of nothing when they have to. John went into those tunnels. He took Tormund and 4 of his quiet killers and 2 of the city watch who had shown a talent for not running and were not yet too tired to be brave. The air down there was not air so much as a memory of it. It tasted of old water and rat and stone. They moved bent over and then crawling. They came to a section where the white had crusted on the walls like salt. Tormund cursed in a language that had been spoken long before the wall had a plan. They found the dead there in a knot like ants at a spill of sugar. They had been stopped by a collapse where an old vault had fallen in a century ago and made a small mountain in a place where a vein once ran neat. They were pulling stones with hands and climbing over one another and falling quietly. John did not give them the grace he gave men. He set them on fire with oil and rags and then pulled back because to watch the flames in such a place was to give the cold too much time to think. When he came up into the square, he saw Daenerys standing with one hand pressed flat to the face of the wall as if she were listening to it. "It's like a beast," she said when she saw him, eyes strange. "It groans and then it is quiet and then it groans again. When it stops groaning, we will know a thing I do not want to know." "What thing?" he asked. "If it will hold us," she said. She looked around as if seeing the city all at once for the first time despite having flown it 300 times in the last 2 days. There was a softness to her mouth that had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with awe. "This place never was ours," she said. "We take it and it is still itself. That will be the story if anyone tells it. That we tried to make a map with fire and the city held under it, like skin under a brand, and healed in ways we could not imagine." She shook herself once, as if the vision were a cloak she had to shrug off. "Regal can fly one more long pass today," she said. "Then no more until morning. Drogon will go as often as I ask. He is not wise. Wisdom is not what we need from him," Jon said. "We need him to be what he is." "You need him to be cruel," she said, and he had no answer just then. That was not a lie he could not live with. She smiled thin, forgiving him out loud. "It is all right. I am telling myself it is all right every time. Someday I will be right." The second day closed its fist on the city. Men built fires in circles too near other fires, and the air became a thing you had to bite to draw in. The dead tried the tunnels and the cliffs and the seams and found each a little more costly than their appetite desired. Viserion fought until the blue thinned and became the color of old milk. The green in the harbor stopped being useful and became only a warning. The ships took the wind beyond the mouth and went along the coast like pigs nosing their way through brush. The gull came back in the last of the light and cried once, and Jon, who had not believed in omens for years, took it as one anyway because the alternative was to believe in none and forget how to name hope. In the deep night between the second and third day, John stood at the parapet above the lion gate with Longclaw point down between his boots and his palms on the stone and watched the line. He felt the dead watching back. There is a thin place in fear where it becomes a kind of exhilaration to remain, and he had arrived there without noticing. His mind had a strange clarity, as if the smoke had filtered everything unnecessary. He counted the ways in. He counted the ways out. He counted the men he could trust to stand where he put them and the ones who would stand where they pleased and do good in spite of him. He counted the steps to the yard where the dragons lay and the steps to the skulls and the steps to the kitchen where the old woman with the knot-red shawl sat like a small god. He counted his breaths until they were not numbers but a language. On the wall opposite, across the black seam of the broken street and the sheet of glass that had once been paving stones, a figure stood alone. It was taller than a man, narrower than a thought. It looked at him and he looked back and they did not move. John realized he had always wanted to speak to it, to ask it some nonsense question like why, as if answers were ever useful past the first few. He understood at the same moment that the only language here was made of heat and cold and will. Dawn came without color. The third day began. They broke the lines and made them again. They took the last carts out of the small gate by the smithy lane and then burned the gate itself a second time because the first had not been sufficient for this hour. They fed men broth that tasted of rope and gratitude. They found a boy dead with his loaf still under his coat and gave that loaf to another boy and told no one which one he had been. They made a pyre in the court of the Red Keep and did not set it alight because to see fire burning men now when they had spent 2 days making fire to keep men alive would have broken something no man can name. They prayed without gods because gods had been far away for 2 days and work had been near. At noon the sea took a deep breath. The wind came round from the south, soft and smelling faintly of something that made men straighten like dogs who scent a master. The green smoke thinned. The ice hummed and cracked and slid with a sigh like cloth being folded, as if the bay were tired of being argued over by children. The roads of wind opened over the water like lanes in a wheat field. Davos lifted his hand and then both hands, and John lifted his, and Daenerys took her weight onto Drogon and kicked him up with a movement of her body that was already bruising her in places he knew, and Regal rose slower but with his own satisfaction. They climbed into air that did not taste like the bottom of a burnt pot. Out beyond the mouth of the harbor, the ships turned their noses with a neatness that made Tyrion smile through the ash at last, small and honest, as if he had been handed back a word and told to keep it. "Now," Tyrion said, "lo, now we leave. Now we leave," Jon said to him and to himself and to the dead and to the city and to the 2 dragons and to the woman who was fire and work. "Now we do not run. We withdraw." They began to pull men back by lines marked in chalk on the stones like stages in a play. The dead pressed each line and were held and pressed again and taken a few feet into the keep and then stopped. Arya turned her pipe into a language and men learned it without being told the words. Tormund laughed and swung his great axe and sang the worst song Jon had ever heard about a bear and a man and a cave and something unspeakable in the dark. Davos scolded and blessed and scolded again, and men obeyed him like fathers. The old woman with the shawl put her hand on the head of each child who passed her and then put her shawl back over her own head as if to keep from giving it away finally. It was working. He was almost angry at the idea, as men sometimes are when a plan succeeds and they have prepared themselves to bear a failure. He kept his anger because it kept him moving. He kept his eyes on the places where weakness can show. He kept his hand from shaking by curling it into the glove Arya had made. It came when things work, the mischief that a universe plays when men start to believe in their own competence again. Regal, on a low pass to clean a seam, caught a spear thrown from far, and it bit deep into the soft at the base of his wing. He shrieked and wobbled and struck the tower edge with the tip of that wing and folded and fell, not like a hero, not like a story, but like a very large animal suddenly hammered with pain. He hit the lower courtyard and his jaw smacked the stone and his tongue came out of his mouth and lay there like a rope. Men ran, not away but toward, because men do that when a thing they love is hurt in front of them. Daenerys whipped Drogon around in a motion that would have dislocated a lesser rider's spine and dove so close to the stones Jon thought he would hear scales scrape, and he did, and that sound will be in him until old age if anything else is. She was off Drogon before he had entirely settled, running to Regal's shoulder, hands on him as if hands can heal fire-made things. Regal's eye rolled and found her and steadied, and he made a sound that was not like any men's sound and was more like the sea remembering a rock. Jon went without thinking. He had decided to go. He ran as a man runs toward his child when the child has fallen into a river. He fell once and rose with blood on his knees and felt nothing of it. He came up under the wide curve of a wing, and the air was warm for a breath, a mercy. Viserion came in that moment, instinct for suffering drawing him and the cold in him lighting with a hunger to make it permanent. He dove at the yard with his mouth open like a myth. Drogon hit him. He did not breathe. He bodily hit him, shoulder to neck, and the two of them slid along the wall, and stone cracked in long, ugly lines. Blue washed over the yard, caught the lip of a fountain, froze it to a grotesque flower. Red answered and turned it to steam. Men fell and rose and fell again. Jon found himself between Daenerys and the open yard with Longclaw up and his body made into a shape it had known since boyhood, a shield that had learned to carry a sword. He shouted something without words, and Regal lifted his head as if that shout had meaning. Daenerys did not move backward. She pressed forward and put her body against Regal's shoulder and her hand over the place where the spear was and hissed between her teeth like a beast nursing its young. Drogon grabbed Viserion's throat and bit and shook as dogs do, and the noise went through the stone into the bones of the men standing on it. The spear would not come out. It had barbs. Daenerys did not stop pulling. Jon put his hands over hers and felt the hot slick of dragon blood and the little bones of her wrists and the hard determination of both. He braced a knee on the ruff of Regal's hide and pushed, and something in the spear came free a hand's width. Regal screamed and bit Jon's shoulder without intending to, and Jon felt something go into his flesh that was not tooth, not bone, not even pain yet, but a promise of it. He pushed again, and the spear slid another hand's width and then came free all at once, and both he and Daenerys fell backward, and the spear slid between them and clanged on stone, singing a high, important, wicked note. Regal's breath came in a ragged pull and went out again steadier. His wing trembled and leveled. His head sank and did not smash. Drogon threw Viserion away like a toy and went at him again as if he had unlimited youth and energy, and Jon did not believe that and yet wanted to. Viserion climbed and fled higher and spat blue in a line that tore through the last of the green and made long steam. Then he circled, took a breath that looked like a thought, and retreated toward the white beyond the broken streets, not in defeat, but in calculation, as if something in him had decided the next move would be elsewhere. Men cheered a little, and it sounded like a bad cough. Jon rolled onto one hip and pressed his hand to his shoulder where the blood was coming out in sheets like paper. Daenerys caught his wrist and held it there as if she could stopper the artery with sheer will. "Do not die now," she said, very calm. "Not today. Not now. I forbid it." "I obey," he said, and it felt right to have that word in his mouth for her and not for another. Tyrion appeared over them with a strip of linen already in his hand, as if he had seen in his head the exact moment it would be asked for hours ago and had been readying himself to be useful in a small, perfect way. He bound the wound with a competency that would have made a maester nod. Davos stamped in and shouted at men to get away from the dragon unless they liked losing their heads for being near a primary discomfort. Tormund laughed in Jon's face, relief spilling out of him like beer. Arya stood at the mouth of the yard with her blade down and her eyes where they always went in these moments. Not at the victory, but at the next problem that would try to replace it. They moved again, and the movement had a new urgency now that the sea had opened its hand and said, "Will you?" They pulled the last lines back into the keep, and the keep took them because it was old and had held worse men and fewer winters and would not choose between them. The dead pressed and found the doors stronger than their hunger for an hour. Fire lay in the stairwells like old lions warming stone. The dragons lay with their heads side by side again, Regal grousing, Drogon watching the sky with the offended dignity of a creature that has been bitten by kin and cannot decide whether to forgive it. Daenerys stood between them and rubbed her forearm, and when Jon touched it with his good hand, he felt the shiver there like a horse ready to bolt and also ready to stand. "We go when the sun is at its meanest," she said. "We will draw a last line here." She looked toward the bay. "I will make a wind." She said it as if it were something she knew she could do if she merely explained it that way to the air often enough. "Drogon can push the air. We will push the boats through the mouth. We will push the dead back with it. We have pushed them with everything else. We may as well try air. Perhaps the gods will be insulted by our presumption and take the other side for a change." He did not tell her she had already made the wind, in men's spines and in horses' chests. He kissed her dirty forehead and tasted ash and salt and a sweetness that had nothing to do with anything he could name and everything to do with her. The last hour in King's Landing was like the first hour of a life. Messy, noisy, perilous, holy because it was itself. Men handed other men small, useless gifts because they couldn't bear to take everything with them and wanted to see an object pass from their hand to another and survive. A boy thrust a wooden soldier into Jon's, and then ran, and Jon found himself holding it long after he had decided. He had no hand to spare for anything but a sword. Tyrion went to the High Septon's chair and said very politely, "I will borrow this," and had it set into the last cart to go down to the water, not because he believed in it, but because someone would, and beliefs make men stand straighter in the second hour of a terror. Davos swore at a rope and then kissed it. Arya stood by the last gate and counted, not men but children, out loud, so the last women would hear the numbers and understand that counting was godhood too. They went. Drogon rose and beat his wings, and the air moved in the lanes Jon had imagined and drawn and spoken into being for 2 days and nights and a lifetime. The boats went down those lanes as if they had been born to do it. Regal, furious and hurting, added his weight, and there was a strange, beautiful moment where the wind smoothed the ash long enough that the city below looked like an old drawing on parchment, lines and squares and circles, legible. Viserion came once more, lazy and testing, and saw what the wind did and chose not to contest it. Whether because he did not wish to fight air or because something called him back, none could say. The dead flowed into the places the living had left because emptiness is a thing that invites. They did not cheer. They did not claim. They simply occupied. The last men on the wall lit the last braziers and came away backward with their faces to the enemy like men in a dance they refused to let become a rout. Tormund threw a last rude word in a barbarian's language and left the gate with his back very straight. Tyrion touched the wall as he passed, not as if it were his, but as if to thank it for having put up with him. Davos stopped, took one small stone from the yard, slipped it into his pocket as if it were a coin he'd meant to pay a debt with, and decided to carry a bit longer. Jon stood in the last doorway. He looked at the lines of fire. He looked at the ash. He looked at the places where the city's old wealth had made pretty curves and the places where its poverty had made right angles, because right angles are cheaper. He looked at the way the dead did not look back and did not gloat and did not do anything but be. He closed the door. They went down the stair to the water. Men made space for him and did not do it obsequiously. They did it as you would for a man carrying a heavy chest who would spill the contents if jostled. He got into the last boat with Davos and Tyrion and Arya and Tormund and 10 men who might live to name their sons after a word no one had yet said. Daenerys rose above them, a black stroke against a blank sky. She made a circle and another, keeping the air moving, keeping the ash from settling on the sails like the weight of a bad idea. Regal followed like a stubborn thought you cannot shake. The oars bit, the boat slid, the city receded, not because it wished to but because that is what cities do when you leave them. Jon watched until the towers were shapes and then suggestions and then a smudge. He sat back and the pain in his shoulder made itself known again. A faithful dog. He put his hand on it. Arya watched his face and did not comment. Tyrion turned his head away as if to give him the privacy of a grimace. Davos kept counting the strokes, quiet as prayer. When they reached the mouth of the bay, the sea lifted under them as if in approval. The line of ships beyond them made a skein like geese in winter. They took their places without someone shouting at them to do so. The dragons fell in above, guardians and gods and wounded animals both. The wind held. Behind them, in the city of red brick and yellow dust turned to gray. The fires they had made wrote their strange map for no one now but the dead to read. Jon looked back only once more, because men will and shouldn't and do. He saw a figure on a far wall that might have been the same he had seen at midnight. It lifted an arm in no salute he recognized. He lifted his hand, not twice, not a signal, merely the acknowledgement of an enemy who had taught him how much a man can give and live. He lowered it. He was a man on a boat then. He let himself be that. They turned their bow to the rock in the east, to a castle shaped like dragons and storms. They would make a stand there, in rooms that smelled of old salt and stone baked in fog. They would sleep on pallets that did not smoke. They would count again, and they would plan, and he would ask a woman with ash in her hair to give him more fire, and she would. And he would look at a girl with a blade and understand that the next thing would need her. And he would listen to a small man speak in laws and lies and believe him enough to live. The city sank behind them into its own smoke. The dead took it into their stillness. The gulls came back in twos and threes. The boats moved. The men breathed. The dragons breathed. The sea breathed. The day held. And in the holding, there was room for fear and for a hard, spare hope that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with endurance and the small, stubborn refusal to be finished even when the story you are in demands an ending.